There's a great story behind the publication of the novel Animal Farm, in that it almost didn't get published. Most of you, especially if you attended middle or high school in the United States, are familiar with the novel Animal Farm by George Orwell. In one way or another, this book about animals and communism has influenced millions upon millions of people. It's a story of a bunch of animals who decide to overthrow their oppressive human owners, only to eventually succumb to the same greed and power struggles that they were fighting to stop. It's a satire on the Soviet Revolution of 1917, and George Orwell was trying to publish the book in 1944 in England as World War II was still raging, while England was allied with the leader of the Soviet Revolution, Joseph Stalin. So you can imagine, maybe a bit of a tough sell. Orwell sent the manuscript to Faber and Faber, where no less than famed poet T.S. Eliot rejected the book. Animal Farm was rejected over and over and over, until finally a publisher named Jonathan Cape agreed to publish it. But first, Cape consulted with an official who worked for the British Ministry of Information, and this official told Cape, "No, do not publish this book." So Cape turned around and rejected it. Later, it was discovered that this British official who told Cape to reject the novel was actually a Soviet spy. Talk about bad timing. Eventually, Orwell found a taker at the publisher Secker and Warburg. But according to Scotty Hendricks in an article on the topic, even this publisher faced a lot of flack for agreeing to publish the work. It's fun to think that, almost because of a Soviet spy, Animal Farm would not have been. I can imagine many people looking back on 4th and 5th grade English who would have been thrilled if this book hadn't existed. But millions of others loved the book and were heavily influenced by it. In the same article by Hendricks, there are a few other books on the list of popular literary works that almost never existed, including The Diary of Anne Frank, Confederacy of Dunces, and Dune. According to Hendricks, the man who eventually agreed to publish Dune was fired after the book did not initially do well. For me, part of the meaning and beauty of Season 2 of Midnight Library of Baseball is pulling back the curtain and letting people see how close Field of Dreams came to not existing, and the people and circumstances that pushed it across the finish line. I think we take for granted that books and films, pieces of art, are just there. These works that mean so much to us, we assume they would have always been there. But no, it takes extreme effort, dedication, and passion to make art happen. And the more complex, the more layered, the harder it is to bring it into existence. In baseball, for every ball player who makes it to the majors, there are tens of thousands who never see the inside of a major league stadium. And for books and films, this disparity is even greater. I think the story of Field of Dreams and the books I just mentioned are so important for artists who believe in their work but haven't yet found that person or group in a high place to launch their career. And just like these examples, you might have 2, 3, even a dozen people who believe in you, but you keep hitting that wall. If you build it and persevere, they will come. I also think it's important to appreciate the razor's edge of success, because we might have an opportunity at one point or another in our lives to be the catalyst, to help an artist overcome that last hurdle and contribute to shepherd along something wonderful that touches millions or thousands, or even just a few dozen people. In past episodes, I've talked about the short story Shoeless Joe Jackson Comes to Iowa, and the novel Shoeless Joe, and the unlikely twists and turns that led to their creation. Tonight, we have the story of a shepherd who, like editor Lawrence Kesenick, fell in love with Ray Kinsella and Shoeless Joe from the moment he finished the first page. And like Lawrence Kesenick, no one else could see the vision that writer-director Phil Alden Robinson could see. He had it all mapped out in his head, but to others, Robinson was crazy. He spent years trying to convince people that this novel could be turned into a film. And ultimately, it was the time and struggle that made Field of Dreams so special. Tonight, in episode 6, writer-director Phil Alden Robinson, self-described as the least New Age person he knew, who fell in love with a fantasy and would not let go until his dream became a reality.
This book really should have never been written. The film should have never been made.
I sort of have this feeling that one of the reasons I was born, was to be part of this, to get this out into the culture.
What they didn't count on was the word of mouth, that people would see it and then just say, oh my God, you have to go see this movie. It ended up defying the odds.
Midnight Library of Baseball presents Season 2, The Making of Field of Dreams. I'm Ben Orlando. In the early 1980s in Hollywood, W.P. Kinsella's novel Shoeless Joe was making its rounds. People in high places were reading and liking, sometimes loving the book. But at the same time, there was absolutely no discussion of turning this book into a film. It was a book, and it would stay a book. With all the different types of films out there, and all the films based on books, it may be hard for listeners to understand how closed off Hollywood was, and is, to adapting certain books to the big screen. Just take a second to think about this. In Hollywood, where it's people's jobs to have oversized imaginations, and after reading such an imaginative work as Shoeless Joe, they still could not envision a movie based on the book. And then along comes Phil Alden Robinson. Hi.
Hi, Ben. How are you?
I'm great, and it's really nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you.
Who will be the first to tell you that he was one of the least likely candidates to become the biggest cheerleader for a story about a farmer, ghosts, and baseball set in the middle of an Iowa cornfield. Ladies and gentlemen, Phil Alden Robinson.
I'm not New Age, so I don't believe in voices, and I'm an atheist. I don't believe in heaven and hell. I don't believe in reincarnation or astrology or numerology or anything I can't, touch, taste, and feel. But I love the story. I can't deny that there's a power to believing in things that are impossible. It's very appealing and entertaining and thought-provoking. And I don't really believe that you can reach into the past and change it. But I know how attractive that idea is, and how pleasing it would be if we could. And really in one way, that's what the film is about, is how wonderful it would be if we could right those kinds of wrongs.
One day, a colleague named Lindsay Durant walked up to Robinson and said, "Hey, there's this book called Shoeless Joe that you have to read." She told him it was about a farmer who hears voices and then kidnaps J.D. Salinger. And Robinson fervently shook his head. He said this was not the kind of book for him. Durant made him read the book, kind of a homework assignment. And that night, grumbling and bitter, Phil Alden Robinson opened the book and only closed it after reading the last line on the last page.
It grabbed me from the first time I read it. I couldn't put it down. Literally couldn't put it down. I read it in one sitting.
And even while Robinson was engrossed in the story, a part of him was already formulating the film version in his mind.
When I read the book, I kept thinking, wow, what a movie this would be. It's visual. I remember reading the scene of young Archie Graham turning into old Doc Graham to save the child. I thought, that's a movie scene. And I could picture it. And I pictured it at night with lights, and he'd go through the lights.
So the process, as you're talking about it, and the reception of the book, and everyone loved it, and it took off. And then what's this mismatch between the novel and the film, and why it took so long?
I couldn't believe when people say, yeah, it's not a movie. But that's conventional thinking. And it
I mean,
took a few unconventional thinking people to say yes. And it was probably 4 or 5 years, maybe more, when I was just obsessed with this story. And I remember on the set of my first movie, Downtime, I'd be telling the crew the story, and I just couldn't, it kept bubbling out. I couldn't stop from thinking about it. And I think that's the power of Bill's book.
Phil Alden Robinson's career in Hollywood got its start in the military. In 1971, during the Vietnam War, Robinson was appointed to an Air Force base in California, making training films for the Air Force. He wrote, directed, and produced these films for several years, before traveling to Los Angeles to make industrial educational films. But he was still far from Hollywood. So after another few years, Robinson took his shot. He spent a year writing a Western script, and then he read a review saying Westerns in Hollywood were dead. So he turned to television and found a few writing jobs, only to lose those jobs because of one strike and then another. The signs seemed to be telling him to stop, but he didn't. He wrote another script that was picked up and turned into the movie Rhinestone, starring Sylvester Stallone and Dolly Parton. Well, the film bombed in 1984. But it wasn't Robinson's script that bombed. Stallone decided to rewrite most of the script, and that's what turned into the movie. But people in Hollywood knew this, and they knew the original script. And now they knew about Phil Alden Robinson's writing abilities. Little by little, Robinson wrote more scripts and started to direct. And it was during this phase that he found the book and became obsessed. He spent years thinking about Shoeless Joe. He spent years talking to high-powered people in the business, but nobody would bite. And that's amazing, just to be able to see it that way. And then once you
Right.
do it, then they can see. They see the
Well,
good.
the system here doesn't reward. The rewards for taking a big chance and succeeding are not as great as the penalties for taking a big chance and failing.
Mhm.
So people are terrified of saying yes to something that is risky. This is a very risky business run by very risk-averse people. And they're rewarded for their risk aversion. A story like this, it's a miracle it got made.
To highlight the conventional Hollywood thinking, Robinson showed me an interesting artifact during our interview.
Well, hang on. I'm going to find something to read to you. Hang on.
Okay.
This is a framed piece of coverage. Coverage is when a studio gets a book or a screenplay, a reader writes a little report about it. They call it coverage. And this says, it describes in one paragraph the plot. And then it says, not recommended. This is a charming fantasy, but the whimsical quality that makes it work on paper makes it wrong for the big screen. The concept is too fragile for the cinema. The material would seem bloated and rather silly as a motion picture. And that's pretty much the conventional wisdom approach, and pretty much what we heard from everybody in town, with one or two exceptions. They all said, it's a great book, but you can't make a movie out of this. It's not like anything. It's not like a movie.
But it was this very struggle and the time that went with it that led to such a fantastic script. and led to an interesting writing technique for Robinson.
I mean, for years, I was telling them this story. I would bore everybody I knew, but the story evolved by telling it out loud. By the time I got to write it, I knew how to tell it because I'd seen people's eyes glaze over in the boring parts, and I saw people furrow their brows and the stuff that didn't make sense. So I kind of had it down when I started to write, but it was the years of being turned down forced me to do that. Ever since then, I haven't been turned down for years and years and years. But getting to write it was a long process. I mean, we tried for a couple of years to get people interested in it, and nobody thought it could be done until Larry Gordon and Scott Rudin and Sarah Colleton at Fox, who loved the book, put it in development and hired me.
The only problem was that adapting the novel to a script for Robinson was like moving a beautiful jigsaw puzzle from one table to another. The fear of losing or dislodging one of those beautiful pieces was staggering.
I was very cautious in that first draft. I was using a lot of Kinsella's prose as the scene descriptions, and using a lot of his dialogue as the dialogue, too much so. And I remember when I finished my very first draft, Scott Rudin saw it and he said, "Congratulations, you've just written W.P. Kinsella's first draft. Now write yours." And the next draft was very similar to what we wound up with. I mean, it didn't go through huge changes from that point on.
But one of the great changes, and I'm going to be so bold to say one of the great changes in book-to-film adaptation history, came from this drawn-out process of Phil Alden Robinson outwardly telling and retelling the story of Shoeless Joe.
From telling the story out loud for a couple of years, I knew that the father and son meeting was the most emotional part of the story. It's not the end of the book, and it's not a surprise in the book. So in the telling of this, when I was telling people the story, I would just hold back that until the end. And I'd keep it a surprise. I wouldn't have Ray ask Shoeless Joe, "Can my father come back and play with you guys?" as he does in the book. And I found that it had a much more powerful effect.
As a writer, this is a fascinating discovery in terms of a writing technique. Find people willing to listen to you and just tell and retell a story, and then watch their reactions. It's kind of like stand-up comedians working out their material, except Phil Alden Robinson was working out a script. And what he was able to discover through this process had slipped by all the readers and reviewers of Shoeless Joe. And more amazingly, this idea of revealing the father at the end had also completely slipped by the author of Shoeless Joe, W.P. Kinsella.
I told Kinsella this, that the father and son meeting was the most emotional part of the story. And he said, "That's a good idea." He says, "For me, the most emotional thing is that the writer gets to write again. That J.D. Salinger is going to write again." He says, "That's what got me emotional." He says, "I was shocked when I started getting mail when the book came out and people were talking about the father and son." He says, "It never occurred to me that that was the most emotional part of the book."
Did you hear that? It had never occurred to W.P. Kinsella that the father-son relationship was the most emotional part of the book. That's really interesting. I mean, they're two different concepts because he was focusing on the writer and you're focusing on the father-son, and that feels so universal, and
Yeah.
that's gonna dig deeper into your
And yet,
gut and your heart.
I don't think the book could have been any more powerful to me had it followed the outline that I did for the movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's a really good point. You can never unsee
Right.
that as
It landed so solidly and so powerfully for me that I just think it was perfect.
Oh.
I mean, perfect's maybe a little strong, but its effect was perfect.
This last discovery, for me, is why this work is so fun. I'd been reading and watching and listening and interviewing so many people close to this project, and it wasn't until months into the work and talking to Phil Alden Robinson that I learned of this unbelievable truth, that W.P. Kinsella had never considered the father-son dynamic as the central emotional focal point of the story. If someone other than Robinson had adapted Shoeless Joe, first of all, it probably wouldn't have gotten made, but if it had, it would have been missing this crucial change. It would not be Field of Dreams. If you like the show and crave more content, you can become a Patreon member, where you'll have access to additional audio episodes, video interviews, and other articles and images linked to the show. Go to Patreon/Midnight Library of Baseball. And since this is a one-man production, every bit of support helps. You can donate at midnightlibraryofbaseball.com, and you can add reviews on iTunes and Spotify. Okay, back to the show. When I talked with Phil Alden Robinson, despite his deep determination to bring this story to the big screen, he admitted to facing some serious moments of crisis. But one postcard and one letter pulled him out of the hole.
You'd asked earlier about what gave me the confidence to keep going. At one point, it was Bill Kinsella, because I had written him a long letter explaining all the changes that I felt I had to make. And I was really nervous about it. I really thought, oh, he's going to read this and say some Hollywood jerk is going to ruin my story. And he wrote me back a postcard that said, "Dear Phil, do whatever you have to make it a movie. Love, Bill." I wish I could find that. I mean, it got lost in a move somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I regret that to this day, because that postcard sort of changed my life in a way. I mean, it really gave me the courage to just keep going and to not worry about, am I inflicting damage on this beautiful creation of his? And his wife wrote me a letter, Annie wrote me a letter saying, "Bill wrote this book to inspire people. He's already written his version. He wants to see how this inspires you to write your version." And I thought, man, these are very unusual people. You know?
Fantastic.
Yeah, it was lovely, because I needed that at that point, because I felt so protective of his creation that I didn't want to change things, even though I knew as a filmmaker you have to. I mean, one of the things I learned from this experience is I'll never again believe that you can adapt a book. A book is a book, a movie is a movie. What you can do is say, here's what I love about this book. Now I'm going to write a movie using that. But you're not really adapting a book. Here are the things I love in this book. Now I'm making a movie with all of those elements. And if I have to change them around and take some out and add other things in, then you have to do that. But hopefully the movie will inspire people the way the book did, and it will make them feel what the book made them feel. But you can't do it if your mindset is, I'm adapting the book. Anyway, that's my opinion.
Although this was Phil Alden Robinson's favorite book, there was something in it that he did not agree with, and that was the inclusion of J.D. Salinger. I remember in an interview, you said something about Salinger, like, he doesn't want to be contacted, just, leave him be. Like,
Yeah.
I wonder how you contrast that with Phil Kinsella, and he didn't have any qualms about it.
I know, and it made me uncomfortable when I started to write, which is why I changed it. Eventually, I was told that Salinger's lawyers had written the publisher to say, don't exploit this in any of the media. But before I ever heard about that letter, I had decided I don't want to make this about J.D. Salinger. I want to change his name. And I just felt like he's asked only one thing of us all these years. and it's a reasonable request, and I think we should honor it.
Mhm.
And I remember a couple of years ago, a documentary filmmaker was doing a film about Salinger and asked me to be in it, and I said, I really don't want to. Salinger was still alive at the time. And I said, he says, but on the DVD of Field of Dreams, you talk about it. I said, yeah, I talk about why I don't want to talk about him. I've said it. Now I want to leave it at that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I thought it was a reasonable request on his part, and the least we could do is honor it. And Bill was a curmudgeon and said what he wanted to say and felt what he said, what he felt, and made no apologies for it. And I admire that about him, but I would have left Salinger alone.
Despite all the work Robinson had put into the project and his dedication, there was a point where he felt he'd done all he could. And now it was up to the universe.
I did actually give up at one point. I just thought after a couple of years, I guess this isn't going to get made. And Larry Gordon, who had been a producer at Fox, was now the president of Fox. Scott Rudin was working for him. Sarah Colleton was working for him. Scott and Sarah loved the book. They convinced him to put this in development. They knew this was my favorite book. So they hired me. I wrote the draft. It didn't take that long because I had so prepared myself to write this. And Fox put it in turnaround, which means they passed on it. Larry wanted to make it, but the person above him, Len Goldberg, said, I don't get it. So by this point, Larry was no longer president of Fox. He was now an independent producer at Fox. Part of his contract was, when you fire me, it's like being a baseball manager. When you fire me, here's what you have to do. And one of the things they had to do was let him take this project as a producer. So with Larry attached, who was a very powerful guy, we got meetings with the heads of various studios. And there was a bit of a bidding war. Once they could see it in screenplay form, it was easier for them to understand it as a movie. And we had 2 studios bidding on it, and Universal was rabid to make it. A wonderful man named Tom Pollock, who was chairman of Universal, said to me, this is the lowest concept movie I've ever read. This was an era of high concept movies, Die Hard on a boat. That's high concept. He said, this is the lowest concept movie I've ever heard. You make this kind of a film only if a voice tells you to. And he said, the voice told me to, so let's do it.
In film and in books, many publishers, studios, and agents want only high concept. And high concept means you're able to explain the story in just a few words. Like Robinson's example, Die Hard on a boat. Or think of the film Air Force One. The concept? The president's plane is hijacked by terrorists. That's it. Simple. High concept films and books are easy to explain, easy to imagine, and easy to market. But low concept films are the opposite. They're risky, but invariably the films and books that stay with us, that sink themselves into our deepest layers, are low concept stories. And often they're the films nominated for Best Picture. Think Forrest Gump, Little Miss Sunshine, Juno, Whiplash, Oppenheimer. And according to Phil Alden Robinson, Field of Dreams was low concept. It was very hard to understand. But finally, someone did understand. Finally, Phil Alden Robinson's dream came true. Over the course of researching this series, I'd read about W.P. Kinsella's inspiration for Shoeless Joe, and heard from his mouth the idea of what if, which motivated him to write. But Phil Alden Robinson told me something I'd never heard.
Kinsella said to me, when I asked him what was the impetus for writing this story, he said, I wanted to write about what the world would be like if it were perfect. And I think that's one of the greatest starting points I ever heard. It would be a great writing exercise for a writing class to say to students, write a short story about what the world would be like if it were perfect. Everybody would have a completely different take on it, be very revealing as to them and their view of the world. But in this case, he was able to, he wanted to write about bringing Shoeless Joe back and maybe his father. And then when he started to expand it, he thought, well, I'd love to see J.D. Salinger write again. And I'd love to rehabilitate some of these guys this guy I saw in the baseball encyclopedia who played one inning, one game, never got to bat. It'd be nice if he could get to bat. So he just took all these disparate elements and put them together in one story about wish fulfillment or making dreams come true. And that's an artist. He created something and didn't have an effect planned for it. It took on a life of its own.
Before a preview of next week's episode, we have our listener baseball stories. Tonight, I'll leave you with a story from Bill, a retired journalist from New Jersey, whose reflections highlight the inevitable hopes, dreams, and losses over the course of a lifetime, and whose insights about Field of Dreams could give any film critic a run for their money.
I can talk about this movie for hours. And I was remembering back to the way it hit me when I first saw it and realized how deeply it ambushed me emotionally. And when Ray said, "Hey, Dad, you want to have a catch?" I lost it. I completely lost it. I had spent, the better part of the movie trying to sort out all the mysticism of it and figure out where it was going and ease whose pain and go what distance and so on. So when Ray asked his dad if he wanted to have a catch, it wrecked me. In reflection on that, it made me realize how deeply it must have wounded me every time I asked my dad if he would if he would have a catch with me. And, when he said no, I'm too busy or I can't do it right now, which is what he commonly said every time. It kind of burrowed into my soul a little bit, I guess, and that with an accumulated, collection of all those little wounds over the course of my childhood, by the time I was actually watching the movie for the first time, it was as if all those repressed little wounds every time I asked and was not rejected, that's too harsh, but when Dad declined, and he declined ever so nicely. It wasn't as though we were butting heads about anything. We didn't have an adversarial relationship. We got along well enough, but he was just largely disconnected from me because of that accident when I was 18 months old, falling down the stairs and cracking my skull open under his watch. So, maybe that's why he declined so often. Maybe that's why he was like, I don't have a catch because I'm afraid if you miss the ball and it, cracks you in the nose. So all those accumulated, stored up, repressed wounds just erupted in me when I heard Ray ask the exact same question that I asked my own father so many times when I was growing up. And when John said, "I'd like that," when his father said, "I'd like that," I'm 8 again, I'm 9 again, I'm 10 again, and reliving that, but loving hearing John say, "I'd like that," as opposed to "can't right now," or "I'm too busy." From my perspective now as a 71-year-old, and Ray would be 72, I realize now that having a catch was tantamount to having a conversation. I wanted a way to connect with my dad. You know, I discovered baseball and started to play it and love it when I was 8 years old. And like I said, you know, Dad was pretty disconnected from me. So having a catch with him would have just been interacting. When Ray asked his dad if he wanted to have a catch, he was essentially saying, "Can we talk?" And when his father responded, "I'd like that," he was responding, "I'd like that." And then you know, the directing in this film was so amazing. It was so subtle. When Ray first threw the ball, after his father agreed to talk, when he first threw the baseball, that was him saying, "I'm so sorry." And then when John threw the ball back, that was him saying, "I forgive you." And that's why after that first exchange back and forth, the very first throw and catch, Ray pauses, holds his glove up like this, and looks down at the ball as if, it's like, okay, and now we can carry on. And so then they continue to have a catch, which is like, okay, we got the apology out of the way, the forgiveness out of the way. Now let's communicate. My dream, you know, older folks talk about their bucket list. I don't have a bucket list. There's no place I want to go. I don't want to skydive. The only thing I want to do is my bucket list is one item long, and that's to be able to have a legitimate catch with my great-grandson someday. And he doesn't exist yet. Or my great-granddaughter, she doesn't exist yet. And my right arm, my right shoulder is shot, pretty much. But I'm trying to learn how to throw left-handed. I'm trying to self-teach myself. I go into the basement with one of those laundry balls, you know, that my wife sticks in the dryer. Then I can just chuck it against the cinder block wall, because I want to have an opportunity to communicate like that with my great-grandchild, who may exist someday. There were those rare times when Dad would consent to have a catch with me, and I was just, you know, so happy. That's putting it mildly. It was not athletic at all. And he'd sit on the back steps to have a catch. To an outside observer, it would be Dad having a catch with his kid. Big deal. But to me, it was the world.
Thanks, Bill, for sharing this amazing story. This isn't the end of our time with Phil Alden Robinson, but suddenly the film no one wanted to consider turned into the film that everyone wanted to be a part of.
People were desperate to be in the movie. And I would get a zillion phone calls and letters. I particularly remember one from Charlie Sheen, you know, desperate. I'll do anything. I'll play any part. And at that time he was sort of hot, and he hand wrote like a 3-page letter about why he wanted to be in the movie. which was very touching, but it was not unique.
Next time, in episode 7, Phil Alden Robinson and his friends select a crew and a cast for the film not yet known as Field of Dreams. The show is produced and edited by me, Ben Orlando. Music by Sergei Papkin and Ashot Danielyan. Good night.